What's your definition of creativity? And do you see yourself as creative? I struggled with seeing myself this way for many years because I'm not artistic. But expanding my definition of creativity helped me to see that I'm far more creative than I thought. And you probably are too. This week, I'm talking with Amy Climer, a creativity and innovation consultant, about driving greater creativity and innovation among teams. Here, she shares the three key elements needed for teams to be creative together: team purpose, strong team dynamics, and a team creative process. We also talk about the ways in which our current structures set us up for failure by emphasizing the idea that there's one right way to do things and by focusing on short term transactional results rather than long-term innovative solutions. And lastly, we talk about the ways in which imposter syndrome and fear keep us from being creative and how creative teams can support one another. Thank you so much, as always, for listening. Welcome to the Impostor Syndrome Files. My name is Kim Meninger, and as an executive coach and former high-tech leader, my personal mission is to help professionals overcome imposter syndrome so that you can advance your career with confidence. Each week, I interview a new guest who brings a powerful perspective to this conversation, including personal stories, best practices, and new insights. The more we talk about this issue, the more we destigmatize imposter syndrome, recognize that we're not alone, and empower ourselves to access the tools and resources that can help us and those around us. Thank you so much for listening and for sharing with others you think would benefit from this conversation. Welcome, Amy. It is such a pleasure to have you here today, and I would love to start by inviting you to introduce yourself.
Well, thank you, Kim. It's so good to be here. So I am a innovation consultant and trainer, keynote speaker, coach, all those things, but I focus on teaching leaders how to lead their teams to be more innovative and more creative. So I do a lot of keynote speaking, training, a little bit of coaching, and I just wrote this new book called Deliberate Creative Teams: How to Lead for Innovative Results, which I am really excited about, and I'm just getting some fabulous feedback, which is really fun.
Oh, well, congratulations. I'm so excited for you and to dive more into the book as well. But I want to ask you a question too about how you got here. Were you always doing this work? Did you have a former career that, launched you in this direction? How did you get to this point?
I did kind of have a former career that launched me in this direction. Early in my 20s and in my 30s, I was in the field of experiential education or outdoor education, where I would take people, high school students through adults into wilderness adventures. So backpacking, rock climbing, canoeing, things like that, and help them learn from that experience, help them to grow from like that leadership angle or just a personal development angle, kind of depended on the context. And so I would do some of that out in the field, but then I was managing a program. I actually managed a couple different programs related to that field. And from there, it's all about leadership. It was all about facilitating leadership. And so initially I was working at the University of Wisconsin for their outdoor program, and then got recruited by the business school to come over to that side and do more indoor stuff related to teaching young leaders how to, just build up their leadership skills. And meanwhile, all along, I kind of had this side interest in innovation and creativity, and was sort of building that up, that interest, and just digging deep into it. And then eventually went to get a PhD a few years ago, about a decade ago now, and merged those things of understanding like creativity and innovation with teams and leadership. And now I kind of blend all those together.
That. And I want to ask you too, how you think about innovation and creativity, because I have, since I was pretty young, always thought of myself as not creative because I don't draw or paint, right? I'm not artistic. And then I started thinking, I built my business. I've been doing this for almost 15 years, and I'm full of ideas. I'm always generating new ideas and trying out new things. And I thought maybe I'm more creative than I thought I was. And so I think a lot of it is the story we tell ourselves around innovation and creativity.
Yeah, I mean, you are spot on. So I would have been, if we were friends in high school, I would have been the friend that was like, no, Kim, you really are creative. It's not about your ability to draw. I don't know why. I was like, even back in high school, I was very emphatic that everyone had this ability to be creative. And you're right, it is not about our ability to draw, even though that has historically been not the definition, but the perception.
Mhm.
So the definition of creativity that I use is that creativity is novelty that is valuable.
Mm.
And so all these ideas that you're talking about, that's creativity, and then you implement them and you make a change in the world. And it's like, yeah, you're doing creative work, you're doing innovative work. So most people are more creative than they think.
Yeah, and I wonder why it feels so daunting to think of ourselves in that way. And I wonder, I always tie everything back to confidence and self-doubt too, but I think there's sort of this fear of I'm going to do it wrong or someone's going to judge me for it. If I put my idea out in the world, it might be rejected, right?
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting. I do think that in some ways we're kind of set up for failure, not intentionally, but well, maybe there's some intention behind it. Anyway, here's how I see this is that we if you grew up in sort of mainstream America, you went to a high school, definitely a public high school, maybe a private high school, you were taught from a very young age when you were just, a few feet high that there's a right answer for just about everything. And so every multiple choice question, every fill in the blank response, like every test we've ever taken, the way we are taught, it's all about getting to the right answer. And then what happens is we become an adult and we go out in the work world, and very rarely is there one right answer for the types of problems that we are trying to address. So, when in your life have you had a supervisor come to you and say, hey, Kim, I've got this issue and I need your help in solving it. And there's only three options, A, B, or C. Like, no, I mean, it's ridiculous, right? Of course not, because the supervisor doesn't know either. Because most of the stuff we're looking at, there's no right answer. It may not have been done before, or it may not have been done by this team or this organization. And so, that's why I think we're set up for failure in a sense, or we're set up to, then we build these internal uh, ideas that, like, oh, I'm not good enough, I'm not creative enough. Well, you weren't taught to be creative, but you're being asked to be creative. And creativity is a skill that you need to develop just like any other skill. And that's what I focus on.
I think that's such an important point because I think about that a lot when it comes to perfectionism. I feel like perfectionism is often a byproduct of the same kind of educational structure that you're talking about because there is always a right answer and because you can get 100 on a test, right? But you can't, when you get out into the workplace, anticipate every question that's going to be asked. Or, like you said, a lot of questions don't have answers yet because we're just asking them for the first time. And so we have to break from those old habits and those old traps that we fall into about what defines good performance, right?
Yeah. I think it's so true. Like thinking about perfectionism and the idea of getting 100 on a test and then making a correlation to, in the work world when you get, your annual evaluation. Like supervisors are actually trained not to give you 100
Yes.
because you need to have room for growth, right? Like who would get 100? Who's perfect? Like it's just ridiculous.
No,
So
it's so
again, like, and then we just get all like wrapped up in our heads and
true.
causes all sorts of problems.
You're absolutely right. And I wonder then what you see as the conditions that are needed in order for innovation and creativity. Like what are we missing, or what are the biggest challenges that you're seeing out there?
I think one of the biggest challenges we're seeing, which we're kind of talking about, is just a misunderstanding of what creativity is and how it works. And
Mhm.
then by default, how it develops within us and how we can develop it in our teams. So the main focus of my book is about these three elements that I identified in my dissertation research, where these three elements are what teams need in order to be creative together. So They need to have a clear sense of team purpose. They need to have strong team dynamics, like they need to be able to trust each other, communicate well, engage in conflict. And then finally, they need to have a clear team creative process. So, what's the process of how they're going to be creative together? So, team purpose, team dynamics, and team creative process. And what I've found with the clients that I work with, most of them don't even know there could be a creative process. And so I lay this out in a Venn diagram, and that's the circle that most of them struggle with. Like, wait, what? There's a process for being creative?
Mm.
Yes. And when you know the process and you follow the process, research has shown us since the 1970s that you will actually be more creative if you follow a creative process. And it's not difficult. We've all done it naturally, but we have a tendency to get in our own way, as we've talked about, and I know you talk about a lot in your podcast. Um, but yeah, I think that's the biggest thing is for leaders and teams to understand how it works, how
Mm.
creativity works.
So is that what, do you teach them the process? Is that what you do?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because I feel like there are so many assumptions or sort of implicit rules or that we're sort of operating in these environments where we're not saying things out loud that would help us to work better together. And so if you're trying to be creative, I might assume that you don't like my way of doing things, and so you're challenging me in some way, right? Or you don't do it right because you don't do it my way, or there's just so many ways in which we don't appreciate or respect each other's creativity because we haven't established that that is part of the system and that it's something that will make us all better.
Yes, that is 100%. That's exactly what I see is that people have different ideas of what creativity or what the process might look like. And especially when you have one person on the team who's maybe really comfortable with that disagreement and
Mm.
just like jumps in like, "Oh yeah, well what if we did this instead?" Or and they have all this energy for it and then other people might be like, "Well, wait a minute. Does that mean we're not doing it this other way we just mentioned?" And they sort of mix up the generating ideas with evaluating ideas and they're doing them at the same time and it causes all sorts of confusion. But if you can get really transparent of like, hey, here's a process we're going to follow, then that doesn't happen. And I mean, I've seen teams generate, 100 ideas in 30 minutes, an hour at most. And the more you do it, the better you get at it, both in quantity and quality. And so when teams have this process, the results are amazing.
And I wonder too, when you talked about the process as being part of the three-legged stool, right, of purpose and dynamics as well, do you think that teams have to come with a certain level of trust or psychological safety first, or do you think they can build that as a result of the process? Like, do they work together, or are they linear?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that there can happen side by side together. I mean, I do think that I almost think of it as like an upward spiral, and
Mhm.
that, you're working on being creative together, and at the same time, you're tending to the psychological safety and the trust of the group. And as people get more comfortable and trust increases, they're going to get more creative together because they're going to be comfortable, throwing out more ideas that might feel a little random or wacky at first. And it's just this positive upward spiral where because I also think too, it can be very difficult for a team to develop trust without doing work together.
Yes.
Like that's how the trust is built. And so as we work together, we test things out. Like, what happens if I disagree? Am I going to get thrown under the bus? Is it going to be awkward? Or is it like, yep, this is cool. And then that builds trust in itself. And so that work, yeah, I do think it's so intertwined.
That makes a lot of sense to me too, because I think you're right. I mean, there are a lot of teams where they might be part of a team, but they're really spending most of their time working with other teams. And so they don't have as much interaction, they don't have as much opportunity to work together. And so giving them some blueprint, for lack of a better term, for how to go about doing that is really important because everybody's stressed, everybody's tired, everybody's reactive, right? And so I think, for when I think about the kinds of challenges that I address, whether that's, fear or imposter syndrome or defensiveness or just the other things that get in the way, I think sometimes establishing what is the structure in which we're going to work and then how do we name that so everybody knows kind of what are the rules or what are the expectations that we understand, oh, okay, I have permission to do this, right? Like I'm not overstepping or this person's not being disrespectful to me. They're just sharing their own ideas. And that creates a better space for people to contribute.
hmm I think it's spot on. I had a colleague or a client talk to me once about how in her team, anytime they were going to generate ideas, they always went with the first idea that came up. And I was like, wait, what? What if it's not a good idea? And she's like, it never occurred to us to keep going because they didn't have any structure or any, they never talked about the process. And so, I'm sure the meeting was like, well, we got this issue. What do y'all think? And so I says, well, what about if we do this? And I was like, okay, sounds good. Because no, there wasn't like, yeah, I don't know. I just feel like process and structure is so important. And sometimes it can get a bad rap because it might, I think some people think, oh, it's going to make us too rigid or too, formal, when actually the opposite is what happens, is it gives you this opportunity to be more flexible and yeah, it can be really powerful. But
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there are definitely, especially when you're growing from a startup into a more mature organization, there's that fear of over-engineering things and taking away some of the informality of the environment. But the more you grow, the more you need to put structure around things, right? And then to your point, that actually creates more room for people to engage because you feel safer doing it.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I want to ask you about your imposter syndrome experience or when you first learned about imposter syndrome.
Okay, so I mean, I think it's one of those things most of us, I would guess, have had experience with our whole life. But when I first learned the phrase imposter syndrome, it was my very first day of my PhD program. And I went to a pretty unusual school. It's Antioch University. It was an amazing experience. It was a PhD in leadership and change.
Mm.
And the way Antioch designed their program is that the two people who developed the program, this was like maybe around 2000, they said, "Hey, let's get together and design a program based on how adults actually learn, not based on 150 years of higher education and what's already been done." So they're very intentional of like, let's design this program that actually works. So the first day of class, the director, her name's Lorian, and Lorian says to all of us, okay, so I know that some of you are probably wondering how you got accepted into this program. And I just want you to know we did not make a mistake. Nobody accidentally slipped in. You're all here because we know you have what it takes to succeed. And I'm like, oh, this is great. And I'm like feeling like super, like pumped up, and then she says, now you might have read, because they in advance, they sent out everybody's bio that's in our program. It was like a cohort of about 25 of us. And so she said, you might have read some of the bios in advance. And I'm thinking, oh gosh, I honestly didn't. There was so much other pre-work and I was like overloaded. So I had no clue anyone else was. And she said, if you did read them, you'll know that we have in this program CEOs, deans of universities, ER nurses an ER nurse at one of the top hospitals in Canada. We have someone that ran for the president of the United States. And I was like, what? President of the United States? Sure enough, yes, there was a woman in our class who ran on the Green Party ticket a few years earlier. She was a phenomenal person. Anyway, and then Lorian says, if you're feeling any, anxiety about who else is in the room, you might be experiencing imposter syndrome. And then she went on to explain what imposter syndrome is. And and she was like, no, all of you are here on purpose. We are not the kind of PhD program that accepts a bunch of people with the expectation that half the people will fail. No, our expectation is that you succeed. And after that moment, the next 3, 4 years that I'm with this cohort, we talked about that conversation quite a bit.
Mhm.
And anytime somebody was, having some self-doubts, we would say to them, hey, it sounds like you might be experiencing some imposter syndrome. And you don't need to. Like, you got this. And it just created this amazing positive dynamic that helped us support each other.
I love that so much. I feel like that should be part of every onboarding process, right? Like everybody who's hired,
Yes.
every cohort should be given that message because everyone's thinking it.
I know. Well, it just made me think of like, organic chemistry in college. We were like, okay, look to your left, look to your right. One of you is going to fail this class. You're like, who is that helping? Nobody.
That's exactly right. Oh, I mean, that is just, it goes, it's in such alignment with my belief in just saying these things out loud. And once you name them, it dilutes a lot of the fear and the power behind them. And like you said, it gives you space to refer back to it, to normalize the experience. Like anybody else feeling that imposter syndrome that we talked about on day one, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it was amazing. I'm a big fan of it now. Um, and I hadn't known the term, but I don't know if you're familiar with the book The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron.
Yes, I haven't.
Yes. Oh, okay. Yeah, it's an amazing book. And I think I stumbled upon that book in like 1998 or 99 and, kind of learned about that inner critic that we all have. And so I certainly knew the concepts, but I just love the term imposter syndrome. Like it's just so fitting.
It is. And it really does tie into what we're talking about too. You and I had chatted a bit before I hit record about how it can be really hard to be creative and innovative when you struggle with imposter syndrome, because a lot of times when you are experiencing imposter syndrome, you're in a state of fear, right? You're so nervous that you're going to make a mistake. You're worried about what people are thinking. And that's not conducive to creative thinking. When we're in that mode, we're in, all it's fight or flight, right? All resources are allocated to keep us alive. We're not thinking clearly. We're not, operating at our most rational levels, right? And so I think that, to be able to be creative, to be innovative, we have to let go of that inner critic.
100%. Yeah, I do think that, I mean, and there is research that backs us up that like fear inhibits creativity. Or when we're stressed, when we're really stressed, creativity goes down. And there was this one study I thought was so fascinating, and I'm not going to remember the reference, but when people have a deadline that they're trying to meet, and they're stressed about that deadline, they say that they feel more creative because they have to like there's just probably all this adrenaline pumping, but the results are actually less creative. And that if we are able to just calm down and like take our time and relax into it, then the results end up being more creative.
You know what I wish, and I wish there were a greater appreciation for this at a senior leadership level, because I think so much of the environment in the average workplace is driven by short-term deadlines, like a lot, especially in public companies where their quarterly earnings are the most important thing that they are doing. So everybody's sort of in this just frenzy trying to get through a quarter without being able to think longer term, without being able to strategize. And so we're all really shutting off that part of our brain that allows us to think more
Yeah.
creatively.
Again, I think that the system is some ways like set up for failure or at least set up to decrease creativity. And I remember years ago learning that, when companies, they're trying to make the best or, make the most profit for their shareholders, that that's actually required by law, that they're required to make decisions that bring in the most money for their shareholders. Like, oh, well, that's going to be incredibly limiting if you're only able to look with, to the next quarter.
90 days at a time.
Right? I mean, most good ideas, not even complicated ideas, but most good ideas are going to take more than 90 days to implement, right? And certainly more than 90 days to see a real return. And but I do think we're kind of in this situation right now, culturally, where the pace is so fast, the expectations are so high there, and then at the same time we're like, oh, we're cutting staff because we need to save money. And it's just not realistic. And it's really hurting our ability to be creative and innovative. One of my favorite phrases is go slow to go fast. Because if you can slow down a little bit, you actually, in the end, will get better results that will lead to, higher profits, higher, better outcomes, whatever it is you're measuring. But if you go so fast, you mess up and you don't take the time to, generate some really good ideas, well, you're just not going to have as good of results.
And a sort of a silly parallel to that, I have kids that are 9 and 14 right now. And I know with my 9-year-old in particular, he can drag his feet in the morning when we have to get him to the bus. And we had been trying to be like, okay, let's go. We gotta go. We gotta go. And then it would take him forever to zip his coat and he wouldn't be able to tie his shoes. And it was taking so much longer. And now we find that if we're just like, okay, tie your shoes, right? Like, okay, what do you need to do? It seems counterintuitive to slow down, but he can't handle the frenzy of, right?
Yeah.
That's how we all operate in these kind of 90-day cycles of, oh no, I just have to get through the next deadline, as opposed to, right, like let me slow down and ask some bigger questions. Can I, think a little
Hmm.
bit longer term here?
Yeah, and I think, that is kind of a silly example, but like probably so many of us had that experience as kids. Our parents are like, hurry up, hurry up. And now we're adults and it's the same thing. And it doesn't serve any of us well. I mean, okay, our brains are more developed. We can usually handle it more, but still, it's not helpful.
No, exactly. So then what does a team need to I'm thinking as I'm talking because I'm just thinking like there are ways in which teams can operate on their own and other ways in which they are part of a larger system. And so if you're coming in and you're trying to help a team to be more intentionally creative, how much buy-in do you have to have from the organization overall? Is it something that can be started with one small intact team, or what does it need to look like for a team to do this work with you?
Yeah, that's a good question. It definitely can start with a team. And I mean, it might depend on the organization, but a very generalized answer is it can start with almost any team.
Hmm.
And there's part of the foundation of the research that I did was based on that the most important people that will impact creativity within a team are the team members. So that's going to have a bigger impact on the team, more so than the CEO or the top leaders or whatever. I mean, unless it is the team of top leaders, but what's happening internally in that team is the most important. Now, obviously, a culture that supports innovation is going to help a lot. It's going to, you might have a team that's incredibly innovative, but if the culture doesn't support innovation, they're just not going to be able to do anything.
Right.
They might have the ideas, but they're like, yeah, that's cool, but we're not doing that, and we're not giving you money for it or time for it. So, well, what was the point, right? So there has to be, some system at a system level, there has to be some buy-in. Um, One of the questions I often get is how do you convince organizations they need to be more innovative? And my response is, oh no, I don't. That if an organization doesn't understand that, they are far from being ready to work with me.
Hmm.
And the ROI of innovation and being more creative is outrageous. Like it's huge. But it also takes some risk. It requires risk to do that because the challenge with innovation is you don't know if it's going to work. You think it will, and there's a lot of things you can do to like test and check and mitigate that risk. But you got to be willing to, you know, be a little rebellious and be a little innovative, right? And so when organizations are ready for that, then that's when I start working with them.
That's
And
a really good point. I was thinking about that earlier when you were talking about, I'm glad you brought that up. The relationship that we individually and collectively have to quote unquote failure is so important to innovation and creativity, because and that goes back to the whole idea of getting 100% on a test, right? But if you work in a culture that punishes you for getting something wrong or doesn't make it safe to make mistakes, you're automatically going to exclude all forms of creativity and innovation, right? Because that's too much of a risk for
Yeah.
someone to take.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Wow. Well, this has been such a fascinating conversation, Amy. I love the work you're doing and excited to check out your book. For others who feel the same way, want to learn more about you and how to find your book, where can they find you?
You can find my book anywhere books are sold. It's called Deliberate Creative Teams: How to Lead for Innovative Results. And you can find me on my website, climerconsulting.com. Climer is how you spell Climer. And I'm also on LinkedIn, Instagram, the usual places.
Well, I will put the links in the show notes as well. And thank you so much for your work. And thank you for being here today.
Oh, thank you, Kim. This was really fun.
Thanks so much for listening to the Impostor Syndrome Files. If you would like to continue this conversation in a safe and trusted space, I would love for you to join my virtual discussion group every Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern. For the past several years, the group has been limited to women, but it is now open, regardless of gender, to anyone who is interested in exploring and troubleshooting common workplace challenges, building better awareness of ourselves and others, and becoming more inclusive allies at work. Check out the show notes for more info on how to find us, and please join us next week for another episode of the Impostor Syndrome Files.